Russ.
Morning, Mike.
Good morning, how are you?
It's just a beautiful day today.
Oh man, that sounds great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming over with your bike.
Great, thanks, Mike. It's special to me. It's a 1967 Honda 305 Scrambler. And what makes it so special, it was my first bike. I bought it when I was 17. So if you're quick on the math, you'll know how old I'll be on my next birthday. But I'd like to share with you, how did I get into motorcycles? When was the moment? And I guess it was about 13 or 14. I was growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area in the town of Oakland. You know, at that time, during the 1960s, they called music-wise the British invasion. We had the Beatles come and the Rolling Stones come. Well, during that time growing up during the 60s, we also had the British invasion of the British motorcycles. What were the hot bikes growing up then? It was the Triumphs, they had the Bonneville, there was a VSA Lightning, there was a Thunderbolt, Norton Commandos, and the Atlas, and also the Royal Enfield 750. Now, why am I saying all these things? Well, as a young boy, those are all the bikes you dreamt about, that I would call them the maybe someday bikes. That maybe I could buy those when I get older. But as a young kid growing up 13 or 14, the funds, you know, they were just out of reach. I would buy all the local magazines, look at the latest bikes, and got excited. And then during the summers, we would take a summer vacation up at Lake Tahoe. And I'm the middle of three boys, probably the only one interested in motorcycles at the time, even though I couldn't ride one. But my dad understood me. And so we would be up at Lake Tahoe, and the big thing then was, well, the Honda 50 just came right out. It was a step-through 50, and then everybody had this grand idea. You could buy the bikes for $245 with 200 miles a gallon. So all these people started setting up side businesses, whether it was a gas station or a garage or independents. They would buy a fleet of those Honda 50s and rent them out to all the tourists. So one day, unbeknownst to me, we were staying at the cabin. My dad disappeared, and then he came back and he had rented a Honda 50. He knew I was so interested, but I was only 13 or 14, no license yet. But he says, you know, I know you want to drive a motorcycle. He says, here, I think it was, the rental was like $5 an hour. So he says, here you go, just keep it on the side streets. Don't go on the main highway or main roads. And that was the moment. So I kind of wiggled away. It was a 3-speed, you know, those step-through 50s, no clutch. And I went down the road, made a right. I went up to the top of the hill. Wasn't that steep? I turned around, and then I went first, second, and third. And all of a sudden, I'm going 35 and 40 miles an hour. And I'm going, wow, this is great. What a great feeling. Just a freedom then, riding the bike. Now keep in mind, there was no helmets, no gloves, no jacket, no protection at all. But there I did. I flew down the road, and it was so enjoyable. And that's when I was bitten by the bug. So coming back home, I started forming my strategy. How was I going to save up for a bike? So I started working some odd jobs here and there, like most people do, delivered papers briefly. And then I got a big break. In California, they had Del Monte canneries during the tomato season. So I was able to work 2 full summers there and kind of bank up a little fund to start looking for a bike. In those days, you didn't have the internet, so the only way to look for a bike or see anything for sale is either through your friends or in the newspaper. So you'd have to look up the papers, find the item, and then call the person, find out where to go. Well, you know how it is when you look at other people's problems. I guess I would call them that. You ride the bikes, they look great, and then when you get up 5 feet, you're going, I don't know, leaky carburetor, it's not finished very well, and so you have to just walk away. By coincidence, my brother knew of a person who had a Scrambler for sale. So he says, I've got it for sale, I need to sell it. Why don't you come up and take a look at it? And the funny thing is, I did go look at it, and it was at night, of all things. But I still have the memory of him rolling up the garage door, starting his car, backing it out, and then the headlights just flashed at the bike. And the minute I saw this bike, it was so clean and shiny. It only had 3,000 miles on the bike, and I just couldn't believe it. Turned the gas on, put the choke on, kicked it over. This is at night now. I really couldn't see the bike that well at night, but once I took off down the street, I had gone no more than 3 blocks. And the bike was so smooth compared to all the other bikes I had tested that I said, this is the one. Yeah. So we got back, I wrote him a check, and then I brought it home. The Scramblers like this actually came out in 1962, and the displacement was only 250 cc's. That was in 1962. Come 1965, the motor was bored out a little more, and now it was a 305. I've owned this for just a little over 5 decades now, and what makes it special is it was my first bike ever, and we all wish maybe sometimes we should have kept the bikes, or sometimes we've moved on. But with this bike came a lot of firsts. After I got this bike, it took me to and from college, it took me to and from many part-time jobs, and one epic event is the first motorcycle trip. So my mom wasn't too keen on bikes, so right after I got the bike, I rushed out and bought a Bell 500 TX helmet so she wouldn't worry anymore. And then a good friend of mine, we were seniors in high school, we had just graduated, we said, let's take a road trip. So we're in the San Francisco Bay Area, we were going to drive over to San Francisco, start at the Cliff House and wind our way down through Monterey, Carmel, down towards San Luis Obispo, taking us down to Malibu, all the way down to San Diego, and we did the trip. What was fascinating is he had his Triumph, I think it was a TR6C single carb. I always remember him tickling the carb. And once he got the bike going, it was kind of nice to ride together. It was quite a difference between both bikes. You had a lower revving Triumph, maybe 5,000, 6,000 RPM, and then the Scrambler has a red line of 9,000 RPM. That's astronomical. That was unheard of, that bikes could be revved that high or maybe higher and still stay in one piece. So that was a very exciting trip. I think it was once in a lifetime during the 1960s because fewer people were doing it then. And you know, we would see an occasional motorcyclist come up opposing us and we'd wave, but you know, I guess it was quite unique and it wasn't quite fashionable then. Some of the features I like to point out on the bike, Honda came out with this, and it was the first dual purpose bike, not dual sport, but dual purpose. So they came out with a bike with 19-inch wheels, so you'd have higher ground clearance. They'd have the higher pipes mounted on the left side so you could be off-road. And then underneath the engine, they had a skid plate underneath the sump of the motor, so you'd have some protection there. And through the years, they would actually make subtle improvements. The 250cc Honda Scramblers that came out earlier had the smaller diameter brakes. And it was 1965 or mid-year 67, they made a change. And they came out with a larger drum brakes here, 8-inch, both twin leading brakes, so you could be assured of stopping. It's quite the motor. Since I've owned it, I've had to upgrade the tires. It came originally with Dunlop K70s, and the back one soon became very smooth. So now I'm running some Avons on the back, a Super Venom, and then a Roadrunner on the front. So it has a much better grip on the road. When I first purchased the bike, the 67 model had the twin pipes as you see here, but then it terminated into a muffler, and the top pipe was welded onto the muffler and the bottom was just held on with a clamp and a gasket, which made the bike very quiet. It still sounded good, but the big thing about these bikes is the pipes. A lot of people who had that muffler, immediately after they got the bike, they took it off. On the earlier Scramblers, which were the 250 models, they did come with these pipes with a set of baffles inside. The owners immediately took out the baffles because they wanted to hear the exhaust tone. And what makes it unique is the 305cc motor has a 180-degree crank where the pistons alternate. versus on some of the British bikes where they rise up and down. So with the 180-degree crank, it gave that distinctive exhaust sound, which most people know if they grew up in the 60s and they heard either a 250 or a 305 Scrambler coming with the open exhaust, you knew exactly which bike that was going to be. They're pretty tight, that's why I use this, but you can see how it just closes like this. You normally would use the knob, but it's pretty, this one's pretty tight, like that. There you go.
So this is with the baffles twisted?
Enough or not's open.
Okay. That's cool.
I usually close them because it's just not, it's not neighborly. When the 250s came out in 1962, there were two people that wanted to test the reliability of this bike. That was the 250. So Dave Eakins and I think it was Bill Robertson Jr., they decided to drive all the way from Tijuana down to La Paz. That's almost 1,000 miles. Most of it off-road. So if you think about it, there was no GPS then. They didn't have the technology we have now, so they had to figure out using a map, and they flew over the course on the desert which way to go. And then at night when they would take a rest, they'd look up at the stars, figure out where north and south was, and then when the sun came up, the sun rises here or here, that would tell them which way to navigate. Now they did have a chase plane that did fuel drops and gave them replenishment as far as food. I think they did it in almost, 39 hours. So if you think about it, that was quite an accomplishment for them. And not only that, but that established the Baja 1000 road race that people come from all over to race that. And I think the next race is coming up this year in November. So that was one of the reasons the Scrambler was here. After it completed that Baja 1000, that was the first one that really put Honda on the map as far as reliability, and I guess you can say the rest is history. What really brings joy to me is that this particular bike, my first bike, I didn't let it get away. Were there opportunities? Of course, but looking back on how hard I worked during the early years, I was only 13 or 14. I knew someday as things improved, there would be other bikes coming after this one. But it's always your first bike, the one you cut your teeth on, the one you learned what I should do and should not do and how I should ride. And this did go on the dirt a little bit. I took it to some motorcycle hill climbs not too far from my house. And then when we would find some open lots where they were terracing the land, we had all these jumps to do. And also, I think, there were a couple learning curves. Yes, the bike doesn't show it, but yes, it has landed in the street once and landed in the dirt once, and I've had to make minor adjustments. Oh, and the only other thing I wanted to point out, and you'll see it on this other side later on, there is a hydraulic steering damper connected to the bars, so it really makes it nice and stable. So riding this bike, I think about it, it not so much takes me back, but it helps me appreciate the newer bikes today, just how far they've come and just how much we should appreciate them. And if you're looking for a Scrambler, in 1967, Honda made over 28,000 models of this one. They're floating around the planet somewhere. I know in the UK they only imported the Super Hawk, but guys have modified the Super Hawks and put the pipes on them and changed out the tanks and fenders, so I think it's quite possible if you're interested in one, they're out there and it'll be very special for you.
Thanks very much for watching, guys. This has been another tale from the cul-de-sac. Please remember to subscribe and click the little bell and you'll get a notice whenever I release a new video, usually every Sunday morning and sometimes during the week.